In this video, the middle-aged nerds discuss spoilers from books they read decades ago. Do you really need a spoiler alert? Do you really?
Welcome to Non-Terrestrial Half-Life. I'm Glenn the Geeky Hippie.
And I'm Bill, also known as Matt Stagger. And what we generally do here is take a look at the books we read in the first half of our life, we'll call it the later half of our life, and see if they still hold up. And what are we doing tonight, Glenn?
This week, we're continuing with the Dragonlance Chronicles by Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman. We're reading Dragons of Winter Night, and we have a special guest. As you can see here, most of you probably recognize that wonderful smile. We have Matt, the Innkeeper. Welcome, Matt. How you doing tonight?
Good. Honestly, man, Margaret Weis, Tracy Hickman, you say those names, and they bring back memories. So yeah, I'm looking forward to chatting about what we've all been reading and just their books and how they affected us. So
I remembered your fondness for this trilogy that you've mentioned a number of times, and when we decided to review it, I'm like, I gotta have Matt on for this. It only makes sense. So thank you for joining us.
Yeah,
this is our first guest. We'll see how this works. We're still evolving how we work our show, so everybody please forgive us if it just doesn't work out quite right with what we talk about. But Bill, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, just wanted to touch on, we did the first book last episode, and I enjoyed it. I very much did, but I didn't quite get that zeal I remembered when I read this series. And then we got into this book. And it all came back beautifully.
Definitely.
Came back. And I got to say, this captured that feeling, that spirit, and I really got into it. And I had to stop myself from moving on to the next book. I'm like, okay, no, we have to wait.
Yeah, I had a bit of that problem too. Before we go any further, go ahead, Matt.
No, I was just saying I felt that same thing about Autumn Twilight.
Yeah. Twilight.
I have great memories. I mean, I picked it up when I was 13, so the prose itself did not match my memories. But I still loved the characters, if that makes sense. Like I remembered things about the characters, and I was like, oh, okay, that's what I remember. And so it's my memories of the time that I recognize. It wasn't necessarily because the prose itself was somehow the best thing I'd ever read. I mean, as a 13-year-old, I did not note any of these things that I noted as an adult.
Right.
So I think I've just become more well-read, and I've become older and have a different taste as far as maybe how I judge things than I did when I was younger.
Yeah.
Since we do have you on,
I kind of went over the religious aspect in the first book that I remember reading it, but it was more background to me.
Yeah.
And rereading it, I'm like, oh, this is a much bigger deal and has nuances throughout the entire first book. So I know how you feel. I didn't pick up on that when I was much younger, and I'm like, oh, okay. And it just changes my entire mindset. So
since we do have a guest on, it's our first time with a guest. Got some questions for you.
Go for it. So
the first time you realized you were a bookaholic, a reader, when was that?
So I think it was probably I credit Margaret Weis and Tracy Hickman for this. I think I had read Lord of Tolkien's Hobbit and Lord of the Rings, but that didn't really tell me that at the time when I read it, it wasn't like, oh, I'm definitely a bookaholic, if you will. And then I started kind of going, I started to end up in the library a little more often at school. Looking into some kind of YA horror. There's an author named John Bellairs. He wrote a lot of those, like Mummy, The Crypt, and The Ring. It was this young kid, and I think every fantasy, every kind of story like this always has some kid who's either like a stepchild or doesn't have some parental influence and is missing that. Like that was true of those books too, if I remember. But even then I was like, okay, this is cool. I like this. But I think it was a friend of mine when I was I want to say I thought it was 12 or 13, who said, "Hey, I read this. I thought it was pretty good. I thought you might like it." And he gave me these 3 books basically, right? And I I remember reading. I might not have been all 3. It might have just been Autumn Twilight, and I remember like devouring that book and feeling that kind of need, that addiction, if you will, of what's next. Where did you get this? I reread, the desire to reread, find more like the authors. I ended up at the library looking to see what else they had written at that point. So yeah, I started. I want to say that Dragonlance was probably when I realized this is my kind of story, and that I would love it forever. This kind of world, or this kind of imagination or fantasy.
Sounds like it locked in your love of fantasy and science fiction. Are you much of a science fiction fan?
I tried Asimov and Foundation series, and I realized that I like science fiction. Like, for example, as an adult, like The Expanse. What an amazing television show!
Just finished those books last
I haven't
week.
read the books. I'm told I should. Told I should.
Yes.
Me either. So,
but just I think I enjoy. I enjoy the science fiction aspect, but not as much as the fantasy. So but I certainly will pick a book up. I think it might just be maybe too much of the science and not the fiction sometimes that kind of catches me up. So
yeah, when it's too hard science.
Yeah, when it's too hard, and when it digs into it from a reading standpoint. I mean, I feel like The Expanse has a hard science aspect to it, but it also has that kind of fantasy fiction side to it also that I enjoy. So yeah, I would definitely say it's a second tier kind of love for me, but fantasy, I'll pick up anything in the fantasy realm, and I just know I'll end up loving something about it.
I go back and forth all the time. I'll be in mood for one for months, weeks, maybe even just a couple of days, and then I'll be in the mood for the other.
Yep.
Other times it doesn't really matter which I read. Lately, I've been in a science fiction mood, so it's like it was hard to distract myself from the sci-fi I've been wanting to read and focus on the Dragonlance, because I'm like, it just didn't feel like fantasy right now.
Yeah,
I'm starting to feel more like fantasy right now, but I'm still in the middle of another science fiction. But the science fiction I really like, the guy I like the most right now is Peter F. Hamilton, who's kind of magic. Look at his technology, his science, his magic, and you kind of forget you're reading science fiction. So
yeah,
it's definitely not hard science.
Yeah.
So when you read this series, who were your favorite characters? Do you remember?
Raceland. Who is? I mean, does anyone read these books and stay in the story that doesn't love Raceland? Maybe such.
I love
exist.
First time I read it as a kid, I did not like him.
No way, really? Okay,
I did not like.
They exist. They exist.
No, I love them now. The nuance, now I'm like, okay, I don't think I was mature enough to really get the sort of moral ambiguity that was going on. I didn't pick up on it. Yeah. Now I read it and I'm like, oh my God, he's so good.
I think at the time I was a little bit enchanted by this idea. I hate, like you grow up as a geek, and there's nothing worse at the time than a bully, right? And whether or not it's at school bullies or at neighborhood bullies, whatever it is. And I think Raceland kind of always, there was some aspect to him that I liked, where I could like live a little bit vicariously through his ability to kind of smirk in a corner and and pursue his own kind of, even though he was portrayed as that kind of weak character that always needed his brother, there was always this power in him to kind of realize his destiny. I read him completely different as an adult, but I think as a kid, I definitely saw power in some weakness, if you will, and that I really liked.
Yeah, I liked Caraman better, and on the first book, I liked him so much less.
Yeah.
He came off as condescending to me a little bit. He got better in this book. I will give him that much.
My problem now with Caraman is he's too gleeful about the idea of fighting, going into combat. He's gleeful at the idea of killing, and I'm the geeky hippie. I don't appreciate that. It doesn't sit well with me anymore. It makes me think of the question I've been asking people for a few years now. How many heroes can you think of in fantasy and sci-fi never kill? And I'm counting orcs, goblins, and animals amongst victims, or try to kill. Even Frodo tries to kill. So it's like my favorite genres have a lack of peaceful heroes.
I don't think it's fair to add animals into that because they have to eat. So for me,
all right,
I'm like, you
I'll
gotta
take
remove
animals
from
off.
that, man. Come on.
We'll take the animals off, but even just the evil races like orcs and goblins, which is something I'll bring up with on this show. You don't see it, you know. You don't see it that often. I know they're out there. People have brought them up to me, and I'm like, you got one. And I totally forget about it. But we don't have pacifist heroes in science fiction and fantasy usually.
I'm guessing, not to switch to the. I don't want to. I talk probably too much about the Wheel of Time. I'm guessing that's in part that there's so many characters in the Wheel of Time that Jordan's able to explore characters whose their only desire is not necessarily to go to war, and that they fill kind of auxiliary roles in ways that are not, like you said, maybe more violent, and that are always violent in conflicts. So I mean, maybe there's some aspect of that why it's an attractive series to so many people, which is it's a little bit more encompassing to maybe our general experience, that we're not maybe personally seekers of violent confrontations or participants, and so maybe there are things in the Wheel of Time that appeal to us differently than maybe something like this. I mean, you certainly read, you read a book like this, right? Basically everyone is walking from conflict to conflict. Whether or not it's in dreams or not in dreams. Let's
see. And that's what makes it hard. That's what makes it hard in fantasy, especially not as much in science fiction, but definitely in fantasy. Kind of the whole premise is conflict, and not just drama, but actual violent conflict, which is how in a medieval or pre-medieval society, conflict was solved with violence. So, it's just part and parcel.
Yeah, it does move things along. That's the conflicts that we have, and even more so, I would say the second book. The first book felt a little bit like everything was rushed, like things happened extremely fast. This one did seem like it took a little bit more time for things to develop in more of a way that I would consider maybe what I expect in a fantasy like this. It seemed a little bit more nuanced. Like, I'm guessing from a writing standpoint, I have to go back. I did have the pleasure of and honor of interviewing Margaret Weis, and I'm trying to remember what she said about like the delivery of that first book. And but it does, the first book feels rushed from a writing standpoint. There are some things in the second book too that feel like maybe this wasn't, they weren't sitting in these characters and the story for years to really get the nuances.
For me, it was the love. There were some love angles that went on that were just so fast.
Yeah.
You get people who meet each other, and within a day, they're like, "Oh, I love her." I'm like, "Whoa, easy, man."
I'm guessing you're talking about Alana and Sturm.
Yeah. Alana and Sturm, also Silviara and Gilthanis was really quick.
Okay, yeah.
Really fast.
For me, when it comes to the characters that I really like in this series, it's always been Tasselhoff at the top of that list. It's just Tass. Sure. If you can't love Tass, there's just your heart might be a little cold. If you can't love Tass, he's just so lovable. Yes, you want to hold on to your belongings very firmly because he's got very sticky fingers.
Yeah, but he doesn't steal. He just finds.
Yes, finds and borrows and holds on to for you. He holds on to things for you so you don't lose them. I like Sturm, and speaking of Sturm, this book is literally the first book to ever make me cry, and it was Sturm dying. as a teenager, when I read that, I had tears pouring down my cheeks. And then all the conversations about Sturm and everything, all that after, it wrecked me. It really, really wrecked me. This time around, because I've been getting very emotional at TV and books recently, and it's just been ridiculous. And yet again, this one did it to me the other night. It was just like, not another book to make me cry this week.
It's interesting because I did not like him at the start, but this book definitely builds him in to what is about to happen. And I had forgotten. I'd actually completely forgotten how this one ended. And so when we got to that moment, I was like, wait a second, because I thought that Kitiara was part of this, and then I'm like, oh yeah,
she was.
Yeah. And all of a sudden it happens, and I was like, oh, that's right, because I can see Sturm in that moment as a kid. Like, I remember the memories I had of this. Was one of the things I remember picturing in my head when it happened the first time I read it. And I was like, and it was just one of those images that stays with you. And this was one of them. And it was a cool reminder to be like, wow, I can still remember this, and I can still see the image back then of when I read it. And I'm seeing it again now, and it was like, oh man, this is taking me so far back.
I've got in my head, I think it's a Larry Elmore painting. I want to say of Sturm laying there dead on the ground in the foreground of the painting, and I want to say Lorana standing over his body. I think I'm not. It's just I don't know where my copy of the Art of the Dragonlance Chronicles is, but it was just. That book has a lot of amazing art in there, by the way. But
I think they did a great job of humanizing Sturm in this book, because the first book he comes off very rigid, very just this code, and as
kind of awful stupid,
a little bit, honestly. But this, we get to see him interacting with other people from his order, and he looks around and he gets so disillusioned while still sticking to his principles. Yeah. So you sort of get a more humanization of him, and it made it hurt so much more for me as an adult than it did as a child. It bothered me as a child, but I cried this time, and I don't remember crying the first time. And I'm like, and it wasn't his death so much as the funeral scene with Lariana doing the speech, the eulogy. That just, that gutted me.
Yeah, it's so interesting, I guess, when I think back. I can't remember my reaction other than I was shocked, I think. At the same time, I think I remember reading this for the first time saying, like, what is he doing? Like, what are you doing out there? Like, it was that moment as a kid where you're like, you are going to get destroyed, but maybe I'm missing something. And the author, like, they're going to write in somehow, you're going to survive this. So I remember it was a better ending to me than the first book. Yes. A much more memorable ending, I should say.
I thought Alana was going to show up with the Griffins and save them. I really did. And then nope. But I'm like, why didn't you take a Dragonlance? I know your sword's important, but dear God, you have Dragonlances.
Yeah,
take it with
maybe he didn't get trained in how to use it, because it must be pretty complicated using a Dragonlance. I mean, one end's sharp and pointy, the other end's not.
Yeah.
But they kept talking about needing to train people in the use of the Dragonlance. I'm like, exactly what? Does it have, like, do you have to hit something on a keyboard to tell it to do this? Oh, it's a blue dragon, set it for... I don't know. I was really confused by that. I thought it was strange. A really odd choice to consistently keep having. We got to train them in the use. I'm like, they're knights.
In my head, it's because of the dragon fear. And what they needed to do was get them with the lance and somehow get them exposed to the dragon fear. Because it can be overcome. It's just not easy. So that was the training in my head, Ken. So it worked for me. The training part.
Right.
It is. It's interesting that you have. It does feel like all these things still, again, and maybe it's because of the reading something like ridiculously long, like The Wheel of Time.
Right.
I read a book like this and I'm like, oh my gosh, this is so fast. Everything is like, you introduce a concept, like you said, just about relationships. You introduce someone or a concept, all of a sudden they're in a relationship, or you find this thing that you've now just mentioned the previous chapter. And I'm just used to like the Bowl of the Winds, plots, and we're like, are they ever going to find this thing that they're looking for? In these books, the payoff just happens so quickly. Sometimes you're like, wow, they just literally brought up the concept of this thing, and then 3 chapters later they've found one, and then they have like a prophecy or a dream that explains exactly how to use it or where it's going to come in. Like there's like this, there is a bit of like, you can tell maybe development from an author standpoint of how do you properly foreshadow something, and there's an aspect of where I have a certain type of appreciation for foreshadowing now that makes it really difficult to like enjoy other interpretations of how these things are brought to a reader and introduced. So I'm a sucker now.
I can't imagine what caused that.
I
really can't imagine what caused that.
Seriously, years of analyzation.
Well, it's like you get so used to limited, first person omniscient kind of viewpoint, or whatever was it third person limited? I can't remember, whatever Wheel of Time is. You get used to that standard, and then you read other ways of communicating with the reader, like this omniscient narrator jumping between point of views within a chapter multiple times, and then it caught me off guard. It took me a while to kind of just accept that this is a different way to tell a story and really get into it. Like Autumn Twilight was actually, I think, very helpful for me to settle into what their standard of how they were going to tell the story, and not hold them to the standard that I kind of started to enjoy by other authors, if that makes sense.
Yeah, does with me. Really huge fan of another series of theirs called the Dark Sword trilogy.
Yep.
I loved that. I mean, my wife and I, when we first started dating, we discovered those books together, so we would share them as we finish them. And the growth I see from that story to this, when they were first starting out, is just amazing. And I mean, you get a little better taste of it in this book. You see they're growing, and they're growing exponentially.
Yep. Yeah. Deathgate Cycle.
Yes.
Rose of the Prophet, or whatever that is.
That's the only other book of theirs that I read outside of Dragonlance, Rose of the Prophet.
Oh, Deathgate Cycle to me is, I have to go back and read it, but last time I read it, I still loved it as much as I did the first time. So, and
Bill, have you read the Deathgate Cycle?
Yes.
We could do that on here because we have 2 of you who've read it, and I'd be reading it for my first time.
I would love to get back in the story again, that's for sure. So if you ever tackle that series in the future, there's 7 books.
Definitely.
So I'm game to have to read one of my favorite series ever again.
We'll twist your arm into having to read something.
I'm looking at the shelf and I can see the first book right over there. I'm like, yeah, I can do that.
There we go.
We can even actually cover the first 7 books of the Wheel of Time, because our cutoff is 98, and there were 7 books out at the time.
If we started, I'm not stopping. I don't care. I don't care.
That's fine, because I haven't read any of them. I mean, I actually sat down and read them since the last one came out. Since I finished reading A Memory of Light, which I've read once, and the other 2 Sanderson books I've only read twice now. So I have to do a reread at some point.
I'm on my 12th full series reread, because I start from the beginning, and I still learn new stuff every time. So
one of the things that stuck out to me, by the way, with this story, and it continued into I just almost said Winter Dragon. That's how I'm going to remember this book from now on, is just call it Winter Dragon. So Dragons of Winter Night and Autumn Twilight, I see now why it appealed to me so much as a young kid, because it's kind of like the relationships are very much written how I understood relationships as a teenager. if that makes sense. There's so much melodrama. There's so the way that people like everyone, every woman that's introduced to a character that likes him is always like the most beautiful. And there's so much jealousy and anxiety, and time is spent really talking about those things and analyzing those things in ways that, like, as a teenager, I was like, this makes so much sense to me. That's exactly how I would feel in this situation. Even though I'm speaking about like some character that might be much older, it didn't matter, because at that point I was like, yeah, he should be jealous, or this is how I would look at this type of person. So that's one thing that did stick out to me reading even into this book, which was just how relationships develop extremely fast. And there's certain kind of obsessive tendencies that I would relate to kind of more of that those teenage years, maybe like the adolescence versus being a 40-year-old, you know what I mean? So yeah, I don't know if you both experienced that, but that's kind of
to an extent.
What I loved about it, the frantic pace and how every scene feels like it's the end of the world almost in the book. Yeah, which is how I remember feeling as a teenager.
Yeah,
every little thing was massive.
Yes, everything was so important.
So I think I identified with it at that age for that reason. It was another reason it appealed to me. It just spoke to me. And that, okay, so yeah, I get this. I get that frantic pace. I get that you see that girl across the lunchroom and you're like, that's it. I'm in love. She's beautiful.
Right, exactly.
Yeah. Like, all the women in these books are so beautiful that even beings of an entirely different species that doesn't reproduce sexually are hot for them. Because we got the Draconians leering and being all pervy. And I think there's even a scene or two in these books where goblins or hobgoblins are being all pervy towards the women. But definitely the Draconians being all like that's just, that doesn't compute. They would not be interested.
For me, I don't think it was sexual. I think it was a power thing. It was them having power over the other person, and if they could make you uncomfortable and afraid, they're going to do it because that's just kind of their
seems
thing.
Like a strange way, but that can make sense.
But that's how I took it this time. I don't remember how I took it as a teenager.
Right.
This time I was like, oh, okay, this is a power dynamic thing.
I think as a teenager, I probably was definitely like, these are pervy, yeah. Like again, because I think at the time, right, I was in school, and so you're around like the group dynamics of relationships. It's just different. School is such a different place as far as when it comes to relationships, when it comes to the workplace, or just among your friends as you become an adult. And so yeah, there was a certain kind of like group dynamic that made a lot more sense to me then, where I was certainly reading it now going like, yeah, that's pretty obsessive. We're focusing on this, like it's the end of the world, like you'd think you'd be focused elsewhere, but that's just, I think, just an age thing for me. I did have this comment. I wrote this comment down. Everyone seems like they're Taviran. It's like,
without a doubt.
That thought occurred to me.
Yeah, I was like, wow, like everybody has things that, whether or not it's Taz with the glasses, and you're like, you just happen to
he's the creator. He is the Bella of the series, man. He is the creator.
Yeah. Fizzban walks in and you're just like, oh, they needed a Fizzban right now, and he walks in, or whoever it is, it always does seem like they're a Taviran of the moment, which I had forgotten about. It does make for fun reading. It makes for fun reading. Like that. Like crazy stuff happens everywhere.
Yeah. But we are seeing characters that do kind of get plot armor for the most part, which is just another word for Taviran.
Sure.
So,
kind of, yeah.
And I love the Wheel of Time, but I will always pick on it because Taviran is just the most obvious excuse for plot armor that I've ever seen. But
yes, but at least has a name, and it has like a concept, which is built into the world.
Which is what I love about it, is because he actually baked it into this, to the storytelling, into the setting itself, and I'm like, that's genius. So, what are some parts of this series that really did not age well? Like things that you don't see an author being able to get away with in today's social environment.
You know, with the Gully Doors in the first book, I kind of had a little bit of an issue there with mostly the audiobook version because the caricature of them was a little stereotypical and offensive. This one, I didn't have a whole lot that bothered me, honestly. I think they fell in love a little too quickly, at least two couples that I can think of. But other than that, I really didn't have anything that clashes.
I think there was still a little bit more toxic masculinity, for lack of any other term to use, with the guy characters being very, very, very reluctant to let the women characters go into battle, even though they've already proven I'm a warrior. You know, Lorana's been training with a weapon her whole life. She's probably been training with a weapon longer than Sturm has, and I think it was Sturm that didn't want her going into battle. But you get a lot of that in this series.
He was trying to get her to go to safety, and she refused and said, "You need every sword," and he said, "Okay."
Yeah.
So,
but there were other points where he was with him or other characters had made comments along those lines.
Her father, in particular, was pretty horrible to her about, she shouldn't even be there. It's a war council. Women aren't allowed.
Yeah.
But I didn't take that as it is their culture. I mean, it's mentioned before that that's their culture. I mean, it's not an uncommon thing in fantasy tropes for, particularly elven cultures, because, women are considered precious. They're the only ones who can, reproduce really, and they can't do that very often. So I've run into that in other stuff like Christopher Paolini's eldest, or about what was that series called?
It doesn't sound familiar.
What was it? Yeah, Aragorn. Yeah, it was the first book, but Inheritance Cycle. That's what it was.
Okay.
Yeah, they very much go into the elven culture in that book. It's Christopher Paolini. He wrote it when he was very, very young.
I think he was 14 or 15 when he wrote the first book.
Yeah. So I kind of am used to that because, like I said, with the whole reproductive rate, women being the only ones who can reproduce, and even then, it's not very often. I can see where they're coming from in their thought process, but the way they were dismissive of her even speaking, that's kind of wouldn't fly today. No. So,
did you say anything, Matt?
As far as like culturally, I mean, I think I'd have to go back and really examine, like, if this makes sense. You don't get point of view in a really consistent way that I feel like I can get into the minds of a lot of the characters. So you do get reads from the narrator and an viewpoint of like what someone else is feeling about another character. But I thought, for example, that, again, I'd have to go back and focus on this, but like Goldmoon and Lorana, and even Kitiara, in many ways, they were not the typical, they did not feel to me as I was growing up like these were not throwaway female characters. Like these were more compelling and interesting beyond the fact that the authors decided they had to be the most beautiful. It didn't feel like they were there just as a reaction or there to be, stared at. They actually had, important roles, and often were rejecting their own kind of cultural, like you said, like their parents are trying to impose a certain idea on them, and they were pushing back against those beliefs. So there seems something, I don't know if rebellious isn't the right word, but counterculture even for the characters. This group always seemed to me kind of like this maybe other than Sturm, but this countercultural group, where they were a ragtag group of individuals that were coming from a lot of different backgrounds, and they never really agreed often about anything. And so I feel like that story still works today, if that makes sense. I feel like the story itself, I'm trying to think of so is there a particular elements? I'm sure there's elements of how they presented individuals, but again, how they told the story from a narration standpoint, it's really hard because you're sure, one character is looking at another character like this. Okay, but that's not how every character perceives them necessarily. So I think if you just maybe obsessed a little bit less about how everyone was beautiful and took that one element out, that would be because I don't think you'd see that as much today. And maybe you would. I just don't see a lot of authors making every female character in their stories beautiful. That feels like a trope that is gone away or is going away.
It's definitely dying out. Yeah.
Do you guys think that we'll see, I don't know if you've heard if you know the term Planet of Hats. I was using it for Species of Hats. It's from Star Trek. Planet of Hats is you go to a planet and they all do this. They all wear this hat, and then you go to the next planet and they're all wearing this hat. Here, and it's very common in fantasy, going all the way back to Tolkien, for species or races, whatever term you want to use, being a race of hats or a species of hats, where all orcs in Tolkien are evil. Straight up, that's it. All orcs and all goblins in D&D are evil. Most of the draconians we see, all the draconians we've seen so far, they're all evil.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing the last author I can think of to do something like that after Jordan would be George R.R. Martin with the White Walkers, the others, which are obviously evil, but at least on what we've seen of them, they're evil. We don't really know what the White Walkers are about, but it's something that, I remember when I was young reading Lord of the Rings for the 50th time. The first character I ever came up with that I invented to write about was going to be about an orc who did not want to be bad. He did not want to kill. He wanted to be good. And yet I rarely have ever seen that until Drizzt Do'Urden. He breaks that trope of the dark elf, in this case, literally dark elf. But with this book, I still see it going on. The orcs and the draconians are, I'd say, with the good guy side, you can't say all the elves are good.
Sure.
I mean, they might technically have the alignment if you were to look at their character stats, but elves and dwarves, kenders and humans, they get to be whatever they choose to be. But it seems like everybody else is stuck. You're this.
But I feel like
I just don't know.
I feel like it is a symptom of just how they narrate the story, right? Because the Gully Dwarfs, for example, how do you pronounce it? Boop or however,
Boop.
Yeah.
Boop, yeah.
Boop.
I feel like that character pushed against kind of the external view of the Gully Dwarfs, and you see Raceland, and that there's a connection there in a way that you're like, oh, okay, so if they had taken me into the mind of and I really sat in a character that was pushing against kind of these stereotypes, maybe they would have told that story. So I feel like it does have a two-dimensional kind of villain. It has that Trolloc, what are the cannon fodder, your draconians are kind of your cannon fodder, and it definitely does do that. And so do they do that as much today? I don't know. I'm just not very well read on the most modern fantasy stories. I just think authors are well, why would I do that when I can kind of come up with a story that's more complex and interesting about these characters, and are recognizing just kind of, creating a two-dimensional race for cannon fodder is just boring writing. It's not interesting, and maybe just people's taste. Generally speaking, we have so much media now that story feels kind of okay, that's something, but tell me something interesting about them. So I don't know if it's just the changing landscape of how we consume media, people taking different chances on narrating a villain and or a supposedly villainous race, But this is something that I would say Margaret Weis, Tracy Hickman do well in other series of theirs.
Yes.
Okay.
And so this is some place that they grow as authors, and they do actually kind of make you think one thing, and then they take you into the race or the group that you've now come to believe is one thing, and they flip this, the script, if you will. So but yeah, I totally see what you're saying. And the authors, this was pretty common. I don't know how common it is anymore, honestly.
I do know that in D&D circles, there's been a lot of pushback against it. The idea of race, specific species in D&D all having racial alignments. I've seen quite a bit of that. Not as much the last couple of months, but in the last recent years, I've seen quite a bit of tweets and posts about that on various places. So I know that there's some complaint in the D&D world about it.
There's there's a series of books called The Demon Cycle by Peter V. Brett. Really good. It's dark, but the main sort of bad guy that you run across in the first book, I hate that guy. They're all evil. These people are just bad. The entire second book is his story and how he came to make the decisions he made. And by the end of that book, I loved him. And I'm like, okay, this is what I'm talking about. Seeing that juxtaposition, putting me in his life and his head for that book absolutely changed the way I looked at that character, because I hated that guy's guts.
Well, Brett
and by
just
the end of
moved
book
up
two,
my.
I loved him. I'm like, okay, I get why he did what he did. Was he right? No, but I understand it, and I can sympathize with where he was coming from. And I think when authors do that, it makes it so much more gripping for me. And when that is pulled off well, I am extremely happy.
I do like that. Brett's been moving up my TBR a lot lately. I'm probably going to get to him this year. If not this year, I got next year, but I got a lot of reading on my plate. I mean, 2 channels that I'm reading books for. So
I'm impressed.
I still have to get you on my other show sometime, Matt. Need to get you on when season 2 starts up for Wheel of Time. I want to get you on with the adaptation. So
okay, so I got a question. Would you recommend these books to young readers today? Because I know I told a lot of my friends about it when I was reading it as a younger guy, and I'm like, would I recommend this to young readers now?
I'd recommend it to people who are in their mid to late teens at the youngest on up, or any adults that will tolerate YA, because this does feel YA. That might be the prose, although the prose was a lot better in book 2 than in book 1. It still has a serious YA tone. Part of that might be Tass, because Tass comes off like a 12-year-old.
I mean, even Fizban is very kind of infantilized for who he is. Which for now. For now, exactly, for now. And I would say yes. I would recommend it. I think I have recommended it, to my kids, at least my daughters who read fantasy. But even like one of my daughters is 18, and I think say like, I think you're gonna like some characters, like it might not all work for you, but this character's story gets better, and there are other books about it. You know what I mean? So I guess it's from an entry standpoint of like, you need to know what happened, and things they actually do have more interesting stories that come about because of it. Like I think War of the Twins or whatever it is, like the whole like trilogy about the twins to me is. Maybe I'm wrong. But I remember those were good.
The 7 books, the 7 books, the 3 in the Dragonlance Chronicles, the 3 in Legends, or is that Tales? Legends, and then Dragons of Summer Flame. I think those 7 books. Some people object to use of this term, but I think should be part of the canon for fantasy literature. They're not great, but they are, in a way, kind of foundational for modern current fantasy, because so many of the people who are writing fantasy today read these books when they were teenagers. and it influenced their minds in some ways. I could probably sit down if I wanted to and find elements and ideas that have been carried through from these books and so many other fantasy. I think it's, it's like if you were to teach science fiction, they would have to, you kind of almost have to have them read Foundation and Dune. You're not really teaching a good class on science fiction literature if you don't talk about those two books. So there are other more important fantasy series, I think, than this, like Lord of the Rings, obviously. But I do think for any good grounding in fantasy, I think these are 7 books that really should be read by everybody who's into the genre.
Yeah, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, for me, I never would have picked up the Forgotten Realms books, if not for Dragonlance, because that's immediately where I went after Dragonlance was, getting into the Dark Elf trilogy. And I don't think I ever would have picked those up if it wasn't for Dragonlance. So for me, it is an important milestone in my reading adventure. So,
yeah, I think if you take it, if I was a 40-something-year-old coming in and reading, these books for the first time, I think I would have said to myself, like, there are much better books. And I might have missed kind of the foundational aspects of the storytelling and the characters and kind of where this had come from. But I also might be old enough to be like, oh, I'm going to go look into the history of how this came about. And why is this interesting and why is it important? And hopefully if I made it through these first 3, I would have kept going. Like, again, Time of the Twins, Test of the Twins, War of the Twins. I remember loving those stories deeply, like I love Deathgate Cycle.
Much more than this.
Yeah. And again, this is in part, like, honestly, I read these stories and I'm like, okay. Hurry up. Let's get to the story of Raistlin and his brother. Raistlin to me is such a foundational fantasy character in my reading history that these stories of him are kind of like everything I read about him is like, okay, this is all in preparation. This is all in preparation because I can see distinct moments of those 3 books and I want to get to those moments. And I know that this is part of his story. And so I enjoy reading it, but these are the ones that got me hooked into other stories. So it was certainly like an entry. I wouldn't say it's the perfect entry place for people that are well read in fantasy. But I think it is an interesting place to tell people to go back and just like connect with these characters, learn some history, and then read these other books by these authors that are excellent.
It's an appetizer before you get to the main meal.
Exactly.
I think Raistlin is probably one of the best characters in fantasy. Probably. I don't know if I'd put him top 20. I think I might actually have him on my top 20 list already. I'd have to look. I know he might be my honorable mentions list, but he's a pretty complex and an amazing character. And I think he might be the first protagonist character I remember reading that turned evil. I can't think of any others that had turned evil of anything that I would have read before this. So
yeah,
an interesting
well again, and because his story keeps on going with like Dalamar's story and like there's this, well, because of what I don't want to ruin this for people that are watching this, but Raislin's story to me is like really
we're full
compelling.
spoilers.
So
yeah, we're full spoilers. So if you want to throw something out from another book, you're okay.
What Raistlin becomes, right? Like that you just don't see that coming from the first time you hear about this character. He's too weak to ever do these things. And reading about him in Autumn Twilight was like tough almost. So I'm like, this isn't the character I know. It's just like going back and reading Wheel of Time and like you read like Rand whining about Egwene about something in the Eye of the World, and you're like, okay, let's get through this. Let's keep going. Let's build the arc. And this is the beginning of the story arc. Well, I mean, it's a beginning for Raistlin. I guess this is the beginning, but yeah, Raistlin to me still between these 2 books comes across. The book Autumn Twilight, that was harder for me with Raistlin. It took a while for me to kind of remember, like, what did I love so much about him in this book? but I remember it being, these are just foundational things, and he became the character that I loved. So
I think the dream sequences with him,
yeah,
when they're stuck in the dream, really appealed to me. And I'm like, ooh, okay, no, I am liking him a lot more.
Yeah, when his robes went black, yes.
Oh, it made me so happy.
Yeah,
I was like, I remember this. This is the Raceland I know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
It is, and that's a little bit, and maybe there's just an aspect of that of his character. There's that kind of perceived weakness, and you just know that the character, what he becomes, and you're like, now it's not all good.
No,
sure.
No, not by any means.
He gets black robes for reasons, but he's one of the most compelling characters, like you said, Glenn, that becomes evil. But
and he's
still
not really
compelling.
Truly completely evil, because he still has that soft spot for the weak and downtrodden.
Yeah, there's a nuance to his evil that is different than like the mustache. There's not the mustache twirling villain in him so much that you feel compelled to kind of understand him in ways that you might not give other two-dimensional kind of villains that other authors have written. So
yeah, I call it the Magneto effect, because he was the first bad guy I ever read in comics where I'm like, this guy isn't evil, man.
I like this guy.
This guy's not evil. He's not really evil.
Yeah.
No.
So.
Well, one of the other things that stuck out to me this time reading it, maybe, is everyone seems kind of awkward. There's like an awkwardness, and I don't know if I just, again, from a YA perspective, right, as a teenager, it really connected. Like, they felt real because they were awkward, if that makes sense. Like, there wasn't a perfection to them. They were just as flawed and awkward as we were. They're flawed, and they might still be adults, but they were still flawed, and so there was something very approachable when it came to these characters. And even a Sturm-like character was flawed in certain ways, where you might have connected him with authority. Like, this hit me, like, I'd forgotten that he wasn't like a knight. I was like, wait a second, what? In my head, because that's who he always was. And so, like, you have that moment in this book where you're like, oh, that's right. And so a lot of this was like rediscovery, of like, wow, I have the future version of them in my head of what they became, not necessarily the first time you're introduced to them. So but yeah, there was an awkwardness, and maybe I think that I'm going to give Weis and Hickman a credit for that. For anyone that's writing YA out there, there's a certain approachableness, approachable nature to the awkward aspect of even adults and being imperfect and kind of showing those imperfections.
Yeah, I can agree with that. I think the books that appealed to me around that age pretty much had at least one character that was just sort of fumbling and shy, which is how I was at that age. And I always connected with that one.
Yep.
I'm trying to think of who I might have read that was like that. And I'm blanking on characters right now from other stuff, but because I'd read so many different things at this point.
Well, like Moraine to me as a young kid was not approachable, but Moraine was perfect.
Okay.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
Like Tam was perfect in that way. Like, he was like Tam, he was solid, and he was an adult, and he did all the, he was, but it was the other people that kind of were, it was the Rand and Matt and Egwene and Nynaeve and Min. They seemed more approachable than these kind of aged, like I think of Gandalf, right? He's Gandalf,
He's always got that presence.
And Fizban comes into this thing, right? They could have made him into a more of a Gandalf character, but they make him bumbling of sorts in a way that's approachable, and you're like, who is this person? He's interesting, he's mysterious, and I want to know more.
And part of what they did, the reason they've got him bumbling, is so that it kind of makes sense that he's not helping them kick ass, especially once you know who he is. Because they really could have kicked ass and everything they were doing with him there if he was just like, boom, this is me.
Yeah.
It's like, but I'm sure there are rules, and he had to obey the rules.
There is definitely a like power steps off the stage often, like so they went to stage left, and then you're like, where did they go? And you have no idea. And the way the camera, if you will, works in this book, you're like, how did they not? That is one aspect that it's hard for me even now from a suspension of disbelief when I go read something like this. Jordan did it pretty well. There are rare times when I'm reading The Wheel of Time where I'm like, wait a second.
Yeah,
he didn't connect. He had spatially, he was really good as a writer. In the story, he examined it from multiple standpoints where you're not just immediately like, that's a huge hole in whatever plot that was. There were moments where, like, the one that sticks out is probably like the inn and the griffins, and somehow the parties end up separate and no one notices. They fly off and people think the other ones are dead, and they need to introduce like a way to know they're not dead, but you're like, you were right there, like, how did you not notice? And you're like, okay, sure. Those things as an adult stand out. Like as a kid, never would have noted that at all, I don't think. I was just enjoying the story, right? And so there is a certain kind of like,
the one
I should
that
not
got
analyze
to me
it too closely.
The one that really got me, they're in Balfour, a port town, and the people in Balfour don't know anything about what's going on in the world around them. You're a port town. You're the town that actually knows more about what's going on elsewhere than any of your neighboring towns, because you have people coming in from elsewhere daily. And I'm just like, what were they thinking when they wrote that bit in there? It just defied the nature of port towns.
If no one knows, then you don't have to handle you don't have to like write for the likely awareness that people have of things. So it definitely simplifies things. But yes,
it did.
That was one that stuck out.
But it didn't make sense. Right there next to that in my notes, though, I do have a note about how I loved part 3, the Red Robe Mage and his illusions. Really loved Matt and Rand traveling cross country on their way to Camelin. That just smacked of.
I have in my notes Gleeman Wrestling.
Yeah,
I call them a Gleeman in my notes.
I have to wonder if Jordan ever read. I mean, I'm sure there are other fantasy books or non-fantasy where characters do that, but it made me think of Jordan when I read that.
Sure.
That sequence.
Yeah,
I couldn't help it.
Yeah, I will say one of the narration techniques, it definitely felt like there were missed opportunities to show a lot more than tell us what happened. Just from as I read it, I remember thinking in both of these books, I think to myself, like, this was an opportunity where I think both these books could have been twice as long, easily.
Oh, definitely.
Words, I think there's nuances about the story where it would go like scene cut, move on to the next scene, and you're like, you didn't have to do that. You could have told us everything between, and we would have been along with the journey for you. Maybe it's smart that they didn't, because again, it's for a YA audience, and maybe if I had picked it up, it was twice as thick. I don't know.
They went on a whole campaign between books. They went off and did some whole big mission, quest adventure between books, that we don't get to see. We just hear about.
Yeah.
But the example of it that drives me nuts whenever I see it is when the author says something along the lines, and then they talked about doing this, and then one of them brought up this idea, and another said, no, but this is better.
Yeah.
Why don't you give us the dialogue?
Yep.
I hate writing dialogue, but at least I try. I don't cheat and say, hey, they had dialogue about this. I give the dialogue, and it's frustrating reading.
I want Ironfeld's backstory. I mean, how did he get that arm? Come on, give it to me. How did that happen?
Well, I think that was a tease for a book that came later. Because there are a lot of Dragonlance books.
Like, did I miss a book? Did I miss a book?
I'm not sure which one.
Oh, now I'm angry. I'm going to have to go find it.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a book about him and how he got that arm. I'm almost positive. I just don't think I read it. It's funny. I
just looked it up. The Warriors #4. I don't know what that is.
Okay.
I'll write that
I've
down,
read
actually.
a bunch of Dragonlance novels, but I've never once even made a Dragonlance character. I've never played in that setting.
Yeah, I've
D
read a lot of these secondary books. I've read so many of them, and they were fun stories. There's a I don't know if you ever read who was the Western author, Louis L'Amour.
I love
Okay.
Louis L'Amour.
So I visited my grandparents one summer for a week, and they were like, "What do you want to do?" And of course, I was a book geek by this point, and I was like, "Do you have a library?" So it was like they took me over to the library, and I got like 7 Louis L'Amour books and read them all while I was visiting them, just sitting on the
Yes.
I've
couches.
never read him.
There's definitely a template. But if you look too close, you're like, oh my gosh, this is the same exact story I just read in these other 5 books. But if you just are purely there to enjoy just a fun story that's not meant to be like dug into and looking for every eternal consistency, and it's just meant to be enjoyed as a story of a journey and an adventure in the West, to me, L'Amour does a fantastic job. But this makes me feel like it.
You almost sound like you were talking about David Eddings' The Malorian, which is just the Bulgarian all over again.
Oh, I've read a lot of Eddings, but I don't know if I've ever read Bulgarian. Now I'm thinking.
I don't remember what it started. I don't remember what it started with.
I went
Magician's
to
Gambit, maybe, or was that later?
Yeah, I feel like I never read.
I don't
Bulgarian.
remember.
But yeah, it has these have that aspect of they're not. I think the authors were. I think Weis and Hickman were aware, like they're just telling a fun story. I bet you if you were like, hey, by the way, the griffins flew off, and they're just like, just enjoy the story. Like, don't worry about the.
There is some thematic work though in these books, which
for sure.
Looking back, when I was young, I never would have looked for themes unless we were in class and having to. I never did for the books I was reading. But yeah, listening to Paul Bamer read these books, I found quite a lot of thematic work.
Oh, absolutely. There's definitely. I don't mean to say that there wasn't thought put into themes of it. I just don't think that they were trying to every moment have, like you said, they weren't like fleshing out some dialogue moments. There wasn't meant to be like always consistent from a what's happening visually from a spatial standpoint in the scene. You're like, there's always a back door that no one's guarding. You know what I mean? But they're not asking you to go like, hey, why do you always use that? They're just like, hey, have fun. Enjoy this is the story we told. Don't worry that there's a back door. Don't worry why we use inns as always like the place where people meet and they get trapped by armies, and no one can get out of them. Or that why we have thematically, I think you're right. There definitely were and are really interesting things to dig into. I think it's that aspect. I just think I'd be surprised if Weis and Hickman were like, yeah, we're really bummed that we didn't, give you a rationale for why they didn't see I think they would just be like,
yeah, details.
You're talking about it, so it works. We're good.
Yeah, exactly.
Glossed over details don't bother me in Dragonlance.
Yeah.
Not much, at least not much. I'm more forgiving of it because it's a licensed piece of fiction, it's
sure.
And I mean, that doesn't mean it's going to be bad because I hear that first there's the one trilogy by the one guy in the Warhammer stuff that's supposed to be incredible. And I have read some good stuff that was, licensed fiction. There's some really good Star Wars out there. But
yeah, you're right. And like you said, from a license standpoint, a lot of things that they might not have either had time to do, or they were not. Because I see it differently in some other stories than in this one, right? That was actually theirs, if you will, their properties. So, yeah, I'm just overall between all these books so far. Just remind me that it was the stories themselves about the characters, I think, more so than what the characters like. I don't care that the inn they went to or the city they went to, it was the characters themselves that were so memorable. And so I think that's, to me, will always, Weis and Hickman have done a great job with coming up with compelling characters for us to
Well, I mean,
talk
The
about.
whole
the
all
friendships, the friendships that they have is just, that's the meat of it for me.
Yeah, it's not the world building, at least in these. I don't really care too much about the world, if you will, in these books. I care most about, like you said, relationships and characters.
Yeah. They had supplement books for the world building for you to read and buy.
Yeah.
So
sure.
they didn't need to do much world building in the novels. So any other things anybody wanted to bring up? Any other thoughts, comments?
No. Like I said, one of the themes that really stood out to me though was sort of Strum's disillusionment with his own order once he got back and got
Yeah.
involved. Seeing the politicking and the fighting going on, you could really see him become frustrated. And
Yeah.
for me, that was a theme that really stood out, that sort of disillusionment, but at the same time, still holding to his own principles. That was kind of a defining moment in the book for me where I'm like, okay, I didn't pick up on a whole lot of that when I was young. I see it now and I'm like, I understand that completely. I think we've all had jobs where we've been doing something where, we go in with this set idea and then slowly it wears you down. You look around and go, this is horrible. Why am I doing this to myself? And see that character go through that kind of hit me a lot more now than it did when I was a kid. So that theme of sort of disillusionment, but still sticking to who you are, really
That's what I saw.
spoke to me. So
the other theme that it seems to pop up in just about everything I've read and reviewed the past year on my this channel or the other channel, everything talks about racism lately. Not even so much lately, just everything I'm reading. And racism is a big deal in this issue, with the hatred between elves and humans, elves and dwarves, dwarves and humans, dwarves and gully dwarves. I mean,
elves and elves.
Yeah, elves and elves, humans and goblins, and humans and hobgoblins. I mean, everybody hates somebody for who they are. And it's just like, well, not everybody that hates it. Most other characters hate everybody. Our heroes, they're all above that, which is awesome. But everybody else, they're guilty of being a racist in one way or another, it seems. And it's just a common, consistent theme, and I mean, it's there in its lack of being there for the Wheel of Time, but it's mostly been seen in The Witcher, The Expanse, Lord of the Rings, Dune. Haven't really seen it that I can think of in The Sandman, but it's been there in just about everything one of my channels has covered in the last year. And it's just like, am I just seeing it, or is it really there? And I don't know.
It's there, but it's in the world too. I mean,
yeah,
it may not be as prevalent as it once was, but it's there. So
yeah, it's just amazing how many books in science fiction and fantasy I've seen dealing with that. Even the stuff I've been reading for myself, it's been in a lot of them.
One of the ones that stands out to me is just, I think, and maybe it was the aspect of this that I liked as a kid, was family, but just kind of how messed up family is. So,
yeah,
well,
like
yeah.
the connections and the things that being family makes you feel obligated to or not obligated. How does that affect your relationships? How does that affect who you become? How does your family play into that? How do your siblings play into that? Like, how do you handle the aspect of having, I mean, Tanis, right? Like, how did his family handle his choices? Goldmoon and Riverwind, how did their families handle that? Like, or even cultures,
yeah.
And how did, obviously, you have Kitiara, and you have obviously Karaman and Raceland, and you have like all these aspects of, and then you bring these, and then they create a family of their own, if you will. And
Yeah.
I think
family is always,
it's such an interesting, it's a reminder to me of like, okay, as a teen, my family I was a part of, right? My siblings, my parents, they were such a foundational part of who I was, but also because they're so integrated into who you are, there's like things you don't like about them, and things you're rejecting, things you're trying to push into trying something new, leaving the family, going out on your own, making a name for yourself, finding out what your talents are, all these things that Weiss and Hickman, I think, tackle really well in their storytelling as they include that aspect, which is, again, I think that YA is a perfect place to explore that. And I think they do that really, really compelling. I mean, certainly from a lot of teens at the time that I meet that were book geeks or that liked fantasy, this is definitely a series that they connected with. And I think that's one of the reasons why.
Yeah, it really connected with me at that age for that.
Me too.
A lot of other reasons. I think for a long time, up until this was one of my favorite things I'd been. I reread it. This is like my third time rereading the series, maybe fourth. Because I reread it a couple times in my 20s, I think, at least once in my 20s. But I think we've covered everything I've got notes on covering. Yep. Thank you, Matt, for joining us. It's been an honor having you on.
Well, for those of you who don't know, to read these books again.
Yeah. And perhaps we'll have you on for the Time, Test, or War, one of those 3 books. I can remember the order they're in. But let me know which one of those you'd most be interested in coming on for, and we'll bring you on again. This has been fun chatting with you.
And thank you so much for being here. And we appreciate it, especially having our very first guest, the Innkeeper. It's kind of an honor for us. So thank you for your time.
Absolutely.
We really appreciate it.
No, this has been it's been fun again to revisit these characters. I'll let you know, Glenn, finding time to read is so difficult, but this has been a convenient,
audio
really
books,
nice,
man.
I have to force myself to read it, so I'm ready. So, maybe I will, I'll look at maybe I need to revisit the trilogy of the twins and see if I can, or if you want to tackle some other Weiss and Hickman series, I'm always game.
Deathgate.
Deathgate.
The rule we laid out that as long as the guest and at least one of the 2 of us hosts has read it, in the first half of their life, it's good. And then the other guy, me or Bill, will be reading it for our first time, so you get a fresh perspective on it.
Yeah, I would love it. Deathgate's always. I want an excuse to return for Deathgate. That's for sure.
Yeah, I've wanted to read that one for a long time, so definitely look into that. Do you want to tell everybody what you got coming up this next week or so here? This will come out with Sunday. So what do you have coming up next week on your channel?
Next week on the channel? Well, I can't tell you. It'll be like a little reveal tonight about what next week's episode will be. So I don't want to preempt it, but yeah, there's something when they hear this, they'll finally know, but I want to still leave it as a surprise. So So I think we're
goodies.
A little channel announcement we'll do tonight. Not related to, there's no like huge whatever famous guest showing up, but it's a fun change for the channel that I think
Harriet's going to be
a lot of fun. Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Yeah, she Harriet was on last week.
Last week, yeah.
Oh, I missed that.
So you have to check that one out. I talked to Harriet and Maria for the 10th anniversary of A Memory of Light. We did a little live stream about it. So you should go. She was there. She's great. Harriet's fantastic.
I've seen her on Twatcast. So
yeah,
she only lasted about 20 minutes, and I think she had enough of Jono.
Well, it's Twatcast, man. Come on.
Yeah, I mean it's Jono.
Small doses.
I guess she's known these guys for years because they had their podcast is the longest running, still on Wheel of Time podcast. So she's known who those guys are for a while. So
for sure. Yeah. Well, thank you so much again for having me on. And
not a problem. Thank you.
Thanks for joining
the Zoom room tonight.
Yeah, let me know when
we had a good chat
digging into Deathgate. So
definitely.
We will
look for you. We'll look for you for the Twins trilogy and for Deathgate.
Okay,
and I'll send you a list of some of the other stuff as we're coming up on other series. If anything you're interested in, there, let me know.
Okay.
Thank you guys at home for watching. We will return in 3 weeks with Jen, the Keeper of the Chronicles, from what's that channel? What the Adaptation, I think it is. She's going to be joining us as we discuss Dragons of Spring Dawning. I always forget that one's name. Spring Dawning. Bill, anything to say?
No.
Okay.
Don't forget to be awesome.